In the autumn of 1887, on the open edge of South Park Basin, Colorado, people noticed Dawson Hale doing something that made no frontier sense at all. He was digging a trench, not for drainage, not for a foundation, not for storage. It ran in a straight, deliberate line from the north wall of his cabin to the south side of his barn, 36 feet across exposed ground where the wind never slowed. Riders on the Basin Road began to notice. They pulled back on the reins. They watched. Dawson did not explain himself, worked in a steady rhythm. He cut into the earth, set stone, and began framing something low over the trench. Too low to stand tall, too wide to ignore. By the third day, the Basin had named it Hale's Burrow. Some called it a mole run. Others said the new man was afraid of winter, that he was building a tunnel so he wouldn't have to walk through a storm to feed his stock. They were wrong. Because when the first blizzard of that year came down hard across the Basin, wind driving sideways, cold, settling deep into wood and bone, that buried passage would do something no fire, no thicker wall, and no extra cord of wood could manage. It would decide which house held and which one failed. If you've ever wondered why some homes survive brutal winters while others burn twice the wood and still freeze, stay with this story. And if you value the kind of hard-earned knowledge the frontier never wrote down, consider subscribing and let us know where you're watching from. That trench did not come from panic. It came from the kind of knowledge a man picked up only after years of watching weather punish small mistakes. Dawson Hale was in his early 30s. Before coming to South Park Basin, he had worked with grading crews and winter freight teams in the mountain passes, where roadbeds failed without warning, wagon loads shifted on bad ice, and a blocked drainage line could wreck a week's labor in a single night. He knew what wet soil did under weight. He knew how cold moved through timber and stone. Most of all, he knew that wind was never just wind. In the wrong country, at the wrong hour, it became a tool that stripped heat, balance, and time from a man faster than he could replace them. He had not come to the Basin looking for novelty. He had come looking for a stop. With him was Mara Hale, his wife, carrying their second child and already moving with the careful economy of a woman who could not afford wasted strength. Their son, Eli, was 6, old enough to ask hard questions, and young enough to sleep hard when he finally got warm. Together they wanted what most families on that frontier wanted: a cabin that held, a barn that stood, enough hay under cover, enough wood stacked high, and one winter that did not leave them weaker than the last. From a distance, the Hale place looked respectable enough. The cabin was small but sound. The barn was stoutly framed. The yard between them was open and workable. To any passing eye, it would have seemed like a place a careful man could manage. And on calm days, that was true. But calm days were never the measure of a homestead in that country. The measure came when the Basin opened itself to the north and the wind found the walls. That was when ordinary things began to tell the truth. The Basin had already tested that cabin once, and it had not been a gentle lesson. The previous winter had come in hard and stayed longer than expected. Dawson burned through most of what he had cut the summer before pine first, then the lighter aspen stacked behind it. The fire never went out. It only changed size. Still, the warmth inside the cabin never settled into anything a man could trust. It rose for a while, then slipped away again, as if something unseen was pulling it back through the walls. Mara felt it in the mornings before anything else. Her hands would wake before the rest of her, stiff and slow, the fingers refusing to close without effort. She moved carefully, conserving heat the way others conserved flour. The weight of the child she carried made every cold hour longer. Eli slept in 2 wool layers and still curled tight, shoulders drawn in, knees pulled up, as though he could make himself smaller than the cold that pressed in from every side. At night, his breath showed faintly in the dim light before the fire was built up again. Near the north wall, a metal basin of water would skin over with ice by dawn. Not thick, but enough to show what the room could not hold. The door frame trembled when the wind shifted. Not loudly, just a constant, low vibration that worked its way into the bones of the place. Mara pushed scraps of cloth along the base of the wall each evening, sealing what she could find. By morning, those strips came up stiff, edges crusted, as if the cold had claimed them during the night. Dawson did not complain. He did not speak about the cold as something to endure. He watched it. He noted where it came through, where it lingered, where it struck hardest. It was in those same weeks that Dawson began to see a pattern he could not ignore. After each snowfall, He stepped outside before the sun had done any real work. He looked at the ground first, then at the walls. The south side of the cabin held its snow in uneven ridges. The east and west gathered it in pockets along the corners. But the north side told a different story. It did not collect snow. It lost it. Again and again. It was swept nearly bare, as if something had passed over it with a steady hand and stripped it clean. Dawson stood there longer than comfort allowed, long enough for the cold to push through his coat, long enough to feel that the difference was not only in temperature, it was in motion. The air on that side did not rest. It moved with purpose, pulling at anything that held warmth, never letting it settle. That night, he spoke to Mara, while the fire held steady for a brief stretch. He did not use many words. "The house isn't losing to the cold," he said. "It's losing to the wind." Mara listened without interrupting. She had felt the same thing without naming it. Dawson took a scrap of wood and traced a line with his thumb along its edge. "Still air holds heat," he said. "Moving air takes it." There was no speech after that. No long explanation. The idea did not arrive like a revelation. It settled in the way certain truths do, when they have been present all along, waiting for someone to stop and see them. He did not need a hotter fire. He needed the wind to stop touching the house. Once that thought settled, Dawson did not look at the cabin the same way again. He stood in the yard the next morning and traced the line of the wind with his eyes. It came clean across the basin, uninterrupted, and struck the north wall first. The barn sat directly in that path, a heavier structure, wider, packed with hay, animals, and mass that did not give up heat as quickly as empty air. It took the hit first. Then the wind spilled past it and struck the cabin behind. Two buildings, one taking the blow, the other paying for it. Dawson saw the mistake in that separation. He walked the distance between them, step by step, measuring it in his head. It was not far, just far enough to leave a gap where the wind could gather speed again before reaching the cabin wall. Mara watched him from the doorway as he made the walk twice, then a third time. "You're thinking about that space," she said. Dawson nodded once. "If it wasn't open," he replied, "the wind would break before it got here." He did not speak of adding more fire. He did not speak of thicker walls. He spoke only about what stood between the wind and the house. If the barn could take the first impact, and if the space between the two could be enclosed low, tight, and held still, then that open yard would stop being a corridor for moving air. It would become something else. A pocket, a buffer, a place where air could sit instead of run. That meant building a connection, not above ground where the wind could still reach it, but low and protected, where Earth itself could help hold the temperature steady. A covered passage, packed in, sealed from the current. It would let him move between cabin and barn without stepping into the storm. But that was not the real purpose. The real purpose was simpler. If the wind could not touch the north wall, it could not take the heat from it. Once the idea settled into something Dawson could act on, he did not waste time refining it into anything elegant. He gathered what the basin could spare. From a road crew working a broken stretch of track south of the valley, he bought a stack of discarded bridge planks, warped, scarred, but still strong under load. From a scrap pile behind an abandoned blacksmith shed, he hauled away dented sheets of stove, tin, and thin iron, the edges rough but usable once cut and overlapped. Around his own land, he collected basalt rock, dark and dense, the kind that held its shape when set right. For binding, he mixed lime with clay and water until it formed a coarse, workable mortar. Nothing matched, nothing looked clean, but every piece had a purpose. He marked the line between the cabin and the barn with a series of shallow cuts in the ground, pacing it out again to keep the distance true. 36 feet, wide enough for a man to carry a pail or push a small handcart, no wider than needed, no higher than required. Then he began to dig. The first day, no one said much. A man digging on his own land was no rare sight. The second day, a rider slowed, watched for a moment, then moved on. By the third, more than one set of eyes lingered. Dawson's trench was too straight, too deliberate to be mistaken for routine work. By the end of the week, people were stopping outright. They did not ask him what he was building. They did not need to. They watched the line deepen, saw the stones stacked along the edge, the boards laid out in order, the iron sheets waiting to be cut. They saw a shape forming where no sensible structure should be, and the basin gave it a name. Dawson Hale, they said, was digging. The words carried easily. From one stove to another, From one cup of coffee to the next, Dawson did not rush the trench deeper than it needed to be. He worked it down past the loose topsoil, into firmer ground where the temperature shifted more slowly. But he stopped short of the depth where water would gather and sit. Every inch mattered. Too shallow, and the wind would still find it. Too deep, and the ground itself would turn against him. He laid a base of broken stone and coarse gravel along the bottom, shaping it by hand so water, if it came, would move and not pool. Over that, he set low walls of basalt, fitting each piece until it held without rocking. The work was not fast. It was exact. Then the ground answered back. An early snow came wet and heavy, followed by a brief thaw that softened the edges of the trench. One section slumped inward overnight, collapsing a clean line into a rough slope. Dawson did not curse it. He cut it back, squared it again, and widened the base where the soil had proven weak. A bridge plank split when he set weight across it too soon. He pulled it free, turned it, reinforced the span, and reset the load. In another stretch, the earth beneath his feet shifted more than it should have, forcing him to dig wider, bring in more stone, and rebuild the footing from the ground up. None of it stopped the work, but none of it let him pretend the work was simple. Mara watched from the edge of the yard, one hand resting low against the weight she carried. She did not ask him to stop. She did not tell him he was wrong, but she saw the time passing, the weather tightening, and the strength it cost him to redo what had already been done once. Dawson adjusted, measured again, and continued. What would matter most in the end would not be what people saw from the road. It would be what lay beneath the surface, stone set to carry weight, space shaped to hold still air, ground packed to resist the sudden changes the basin was known for. The rough shape above would draw the laughter. The unseen work below would decide if the laughter lasted. By the time the last boards were set and the final seams covered, the structure no longer resembled anything familiar to the basin. Dawson kept the roof low, sloping just enough to shed what snow would not settle. Over the frame, he laid the cut iron in overlapping sheets, sealing the joints against water as best he could with what he had. Beneath it, a rough barrier held back moisture from the earth. Then came the part that changed how the whole thing looked. He pushed the excavated soil back against the sides, packed it in. Layer by layer, he built it up along both walls and over the spine of the passage, until the wood and iron beneath all but disappeared. What had begun as a trench became a buried line. What had been a structure became a mound. From a distance, it no longer looked like a walkway. It looked like a low rise of earth growing between the cabin and the barn, with two dark openings cut into either end. No windows, no height, no sign of comfort. Just a shape that did not belong among the upright lines of the other buildings in the basin. Mara stood beside it when the work was done, one arm drawn across her stomach, the other resting against her side. She did not speak. She did not need to. She knew how it would be seen, not as shelter, not as care, but as something strange, maybe even desperate. Dawson did not look at the structure for long. His eyes moved past it, out across the open ground to the north, where the land flattened and the wind gathered itself before crossing the basin. He watched that line the way a man watches a river before stepping in. There was no sense of completion in him, no pride to show, no relief to claim, only a quiet understanding. The work was finished. The answer had not yet been tested. The first man to come out and look closely was not one of the loud ones. It was Amos Redden, a seasoned local builder who had framed and repaired more cabins in the basin than most men could count. He did not arrive with laughter. He came with a habit of measuring things in his head before he spoke. Amos walked the length of the mound slowly. He tapped along the edges with the handle of his axe, testing where wood met stone, where iron met frame. He paused at the junction where the buried passage joined the cabin wall. He crouched once, pressed his hand into the packed earth, and held it there a moment longer than necessary. When he stood again, his judgment was already formed. "You've buried your weak side," he said, not unkindly, "and you've buried wood with it." He pointed to the line where the tunnel met the cabin. "Snow will settle there. It'll melt when the sun shifts, then freeze again at night. Water will sit in that seam. You won't see it the first season, maybe not the second, but it'll get in. And once it does, it won't leave." He moved his hand across the slope of packed soil. Earth against timber holds moisture, always has. You've taken something that needs to breathe and pressed it into the ground. There was no anger in his voice, only certainty built from years of watching wood fail in slow, quiet ways. Dawson listened without interrupting. When Amos finished, Dawson answered in the same measured tone. "The base drains," he said. "Stone and grade carry water away. Air inside doesn't move. That's the point. Wind stays outside." He did not expand beyond that. He did not argue detail for detail. Amos shook his head once. "It's not the wind I'd be worried about," he said. "It's what you've sealed in." He stepped back, looking at the mound as a whole. To him, it was not a solution. It was a delay before failure. And that judgment would carry further than any laughter. The laughter reached its loudest form at the trading post. Jeb Crowley, a cattle hand known more for his voice than his judgment, leaned back against a flour barrel and called it out for the room to hear. "Hale's digging himself a mole run," he said. "Figure he'll be sleeping underground before the snow does the burying for him." The men around him laughed, not all of them, but enough for the name to stick. Hale's burrow. It spread the way such things always did, easy to repeat, easy to picture, and easier still to believe when a man's work did not look like anything anyone recognized. But the harder weight did not fall in that room. It settled outside, in the quieter exchanges where voices dropped and eyes lingered too long. Women passing Mara near the well or along the track spoke gently, as if gentleness could soften what they were really saying. They asked if she was managing, if she was warm enough, if she needed anything brought over. Their concern carried a shape she could not mistake. It was the shape of doubt, not in her, but in the man she lived with. Mara answered each question plainly. She did not defend the work. She did not explain it, but she felt the distance grow between her household and the rest of the basin, with every careful word offered in that tone. Wade Mercer, Mara's older brother, a ranch hand who had worked the lower basin for years and knew the weight of reputation in a place where men depended on one another, arrived 2 days later, riding in from the lower end of the valley. He dismounted without comment and walked the line of the mound once before turning to Dawson. He did not laugh. "You can build what you want," Wade said. "But out here, a man doesn't stand alone the way he thinks he does. Folks trade with you, work alongside you. Trust matters. If they stop taking you serious, that follows you into everything else." It was not an insult. It was a warning shaped by experience. Dawson stood with his hands at his sides, listening the same way he had listened to Amos. When Wade finished, Dawson answered. "I didn't build it for them," he said. He looked once toward the cabin, where the north wall faced the open basin. "I built it so my boy doesn't wake up with ice at the edge of his blanket," he said. "And so Mara doesn't have to bring a child into a house the wind can empty." There was nothing more added to it. No defense of pride, no argument about opinion, just a line drawn between what people thought and what the winter would decide. The storm did not arrive the way stories often soften it. It did not drift in with quiet flakes, or give warning enough for men to prepare at their own pace. It came down out of the north as a force already formed, already moving, already certain of what it would do once it reached the open basin. The first winds cut across the land in long, unbroken lines. Snow did not fall so much as it was driven, pulled sideways, stretched thin, then packed hard against anything that stood in its way. Fences vanished at their base. Barn doors sealed along their edges. The ground itself began to disappear beneath a skin that was no longer soft, but fixed and resistant. Temperature did not ease downward. It dropped in steps, each day marking a colder point than the last, until the numbers no longer mattered and only the effect remained. Water slowed, then stiffened, then held. The sun rose when it was meant to, but it offered nothing. It hung behind a thin veil of cloud, pale and distant, like a piece of metal set too far away to give heat. At night, the wind did not rest. It pressed against walls. It found every seam. It set the boards to a constant, low strain that never broke but never stopped. The sound filled the hours, not loud enough to panic, but steady enough that no one forgot it was there. Across the basin, each homestead stood on what it had built and what it believed would hold. No voices argued anymore. No laughter carried between houses. Nature had stepped forward without announcement, and it did not need to speak. It only began to test. The storm did not pass in a day. It held, and under that steady pressure, the basin began to show where it had been weak all along. Fires were fed harder than before. Men split wood until their hands stiffened, carried it in armloads, stacked it close to the stove, and still the rooms would not settle into warmth. Heat rose, then slipped away again, pulled thin by the same unseen force that had always been there, now working without interruption. Chimneys changed their sound. What had once been a steady draw turned uneven, then harsh, as wind pressed down and across the flues. Smoke wavered. In some houses, it curled back into the room before finding its way out again. Doors stiffened at the hinges. Frost built along the seams, thickening with each night, locking boards tighter than they had been set in summer. Men leaned their weight into them to break them free each morning. In a half-sheltered barn near the eastern edge of the basin, a calf went down and did not rise again. It stood where it had been tied, then froze where it had stood. On the western side, a woman pulled her stove closer to the wall than any builder would have advised. The wood behind it darkened, then charred in a slow, creeping line, the price of holding the room just above the point where water would freeze. Wade Mercer worked through what he had stacked for the season and began cutting into what had never been meant for fuel. Old fence rails, broken posts, anything dry enough to burn. The pile that had once marked the boundary of his land disappeared one length at a time. No one laughed now. There was no space left for it. Across the basin, families turned their attention inward. They watched the fire. They checked the water. They listened for the sound of a child's breathing in the night, measuring each cough against what they knew winter could take if it was given time. Out there, reputation did not matter. Not against cold that did not argue. Not against wind that did not stop. Then, without announcement, the basin began to notice something it could not easily explain. Not a miracle. Not a sudden change that forced belief. Just a series of small details that did not fit the pattern everyone else was living through. From the road, Dawson Hale's chimney did not behave the same way as the others. The smoke was not thick or driven hard. It rose in a narrow, steady line, pale against the sky, as if the fire beneath it was working with the house instead of fighting against it. A rider passing near the property slowed when he saw Dawson step out of the barn, pull the door closed behind him, and disappear into the low opening of that buried passage. A moment later, he emerged at the cabin's side, moving without hurry, dressed in a heavy shirt and light gloves clothing that did not match the force of the weather pressing across the rest of the basin. The rider did not stop. He carried the image with him. Later that same day, a boy delivering a message from the lower valley paused near the Hale place long enough to look through the cabin window. He saw Eli sitting close to the glass, tracing shapes with his finger, not through frost, through a thin film of moisture that gathered and cleared with each breath inside. The boy stood there a moment, uncertain of what he was seeing, then moved on. None of these things were enough to overturn what people believed. Not yet, but they unsettled it. In the trading post, the laughter still came, but it did not carry as far. The name Halesboro was still used, but with a hesitation that had not been there before, because something in that place was behaving differently, and no one had an easy reason for it. By the last stretch of December, when the wind cut across a man's face like fine shards, and the cold held without pause, Amos Redden made his way to the Hale place. He loaded a small sled with dry wood and pulled it behind him, not out of charity alone, but out of a builder's instinct. He had given his judgment. He had said what would fail, and in a winter like this, failure did not stay theoretical for long. He expected to find strain, smoke, a man burning through what he had left. He reached the cabin and knocked. Mara opened the door. What met Amos was not what he had prepared himself for. It was not the sight of the room that struck him first. It was the air, warm, dry, even, not the kind of heat that came in waves from a stove fighting to keep up, but a settled warmth that held in place. There was no sharp edge of smoke in it, no cold current brushing along the floor, just a room that was not losing what it had. Inside, Eli sat at the table, hands free, shoulders loose, not wrapped in layers that never seemed enough. He looked up briefly, then returned to what he was doing, as if this condition required no attention. Mara stood a few steps back, one hand resting low, her balance steady. There was color in her face, not the strained look of someone enduring, but of someone holding. From the far side, the inner door opened. Dawson stepped in from the tunnel, carrying a pail, the cold left behind him as the door closed. He set it down without ceremony, as though moving between barn and house in such weather required no special effort. No one raised their voice. No one pointed to anything as proof. There was no explanation offered, no claim made. But the difference was there. complete and undeniable. Amos stood in that room and understood, without being told, that he had been looking at the wrong problem. Outside, the wind continued as it had all week. Inside, it had no place to reach. The first impression held. Then Amos began to work through it the only way he knew how. He asked questions, not broad ones, not polite ones, direct, practical questions that measured a system by what it consumed and what it held. "What are you burning?" he asked. "Lodgepole mostly," Dawson said. "Some old juniper mixed in." "How much?" "Less than a cord this month." Amos did not answer right away. He knew what most men in the basin had already burned through. He had cut and stacked enough winters himself to measure that difference without needing it explained. He glanced toward the stove, then around the room again. The heat was not uneven. It did not spike near the fire and fade at the walls. It held across the space, quiet and constant. His eyes moved to the thermometer mounted near the inner post. The number there, set against what he had felt outside only moments before, did not align with anything he had built his understanding on. The gap between the two was too wide. Not impossible, but wrong, according to every habit he had trusted. Dawson did not point it out. He turned instead and opened the inner door. Amos followed him into the passage. The air changed, but not in the way a man expected stepping away from a heated room. It cooled slightly, but it did not move. It did not carry the force that had been pressing against every wall in the basin. It sat there, held in place by the ground around it, by the shape Dawson had given it. No whistle, no draft, no pull at the seams, just stillness. Dawson rested his hand briefly against the packed wall. "It doesn't touch the house anymore," he said. That was all. Amos stood there long enough to let the statement settle. Then he gave a single, quiet nod, not to agree with a man, but to acknowledge that what he had believed about surviving this kind of winter had been incomplete, and that the difference between holding and failing had been there all along. What followed did not spread as laughter anymore. It spread as questions. Men who had not stepped onto the Hale property before now found reasons to pass near it. They did not point. They did not speak loudly, but they looked longer than they used to, measuring something they could no longer dismiss. Professor Linus Bell arrived within a week, a county surveyor and weather recorder who kept seasonal notes for anyone willing to read them. He came with instruments, a notebook, and the habit of writing things down before forming an opinion. He took readings outside first. Wind speed across the open stretched north of the cabin, temperature at ground level, the way snow had packed and hardened along the fence line. Then he stepped inside. He recorded the interior temperature, not once, but at several points in the room. He noted the absence of draft along the floor. He asked to see what Dawson had kept through the season. Dawson brought out a small ledger, nothing formal, just dates, numbers, brief marks. Outside temperature, inside temperature, wind direction, wood used each day. Bell read through it slowly, cross-checking what he had measured against what had already been written. The pattern held. Not perfectly, no real system ever did, but consistently enough to leave little room for chance. This was not luck. It was structure meeting condition in the right way. Wade Mercer returned not long after. He did not offer an apology, not because he lacked the sense for it, but because the basin had its own way of correcting men without requiring them to say the words aloud. He stood near the edge of the yard and looked toward the north. "What would you change first?" he asked. "If you had to hold that side better?" Dawson answered without turning it into instruction. "Break the wind before it reaches your wall," he said. "Then give the air a place to stop." That was enough. By the time the worst of the season eased, the basin had begun to adjust. Some men dug shallow, building up earth along the exposed side of their cabins. Others set low sheds or storage runs between structures, closing the open gaps where wind had once gathered strength. Not all could build deep. Not all had the same ground or time. But the idea moved through the valley in forms that fit each place. When spring came, the snow withdrew in stages, revealing those changes one by one. No announcement marked the shift. No single day declared that something had been learned. It showed itself in smaller ways. In a yard where woodpiles had lasted longer, in walls that no longer carried frost on the inside, in houses that did not have to fight as hard to hold what they made. The following winter came again, as it always did. And in one of the homes near the western rise, a child crossed the floor in wool socks, without pulling a blanket tight around his shoulders, without pausing at the stove to gather what warmth he could before moving on. No one called it a new method. No one gave it a name worth repeating. Dawson Hale did not claim it. He stood once at the edge of his land, looking out over the same open ground that had carried the wind all those years, and spoke the only conclusion that mattered. "The earth keeps heat," he said. "The wind takes it." He left the rest unsaid, because what remained had already been proven. What would you have thought seeing a man dig a tunnel between his cabin and barn, smart or completely crazy?